Did you know that the Democratic Party was once considered to be the party of the people, meaning that it championed the causes of working and middle-class Americans? And it might surprise many to learn that even before Donald Trump would ultimately gain control over it, the Republican Party was thought of as the party of the rich. At some point, however, in the last 50 or so years, the Democratic Party, meaning the top-down functioning political organization that emanates from high offices and corridors of great power, has ceased to actually function as the party of the people. It's an argument many lifelong Democrats could make in our sleep. The way we see it, the political party so many of us faithfully placed our hopes in our entire lives can't possibly care about the concerns most Americans have about the direction our country is headed. Many disillusioned former Democrats have come to believe the party no longer cares about progress, not true progress anyway, the kind that could improve the lives of the working-class Americans who used to form the party's base. But then so many Americans know that our politics is broken, that our government no longer functions on behalf of the citizens of this country. We know the whole system is in the hands of elites with no real interest or connection to the average citizen. So many of us have known all this for decades, but to understand why this is and what it means for the future of this country, we have to dissect and study the many pieces of that system, at least briefly, and then put it all back together again and take it in as a whole. Both of our major political parties, and consequently our entire federal government, actually consists of a vast network of powerful entities, some operating within our government, some just outside of it. Those that exist outside of government are, of course, operating beyond the control of the American voting public. These include politically aligned non-government organizations known as NGOs, as well as think tanks, lobbying firms, foreign policy specialists, the national security and military consultants, economic councils, private foundations, and even nonprofit special interest groups that advocate for literally hundreds of issues that are of concern to a wide range of Americans.
Add to that the revolving door that exists between all of this, mostly off the public payroll political infrastructure, and the actual elected officials in our government and their staffs, as well as the unelected bureaucratic millions in the executive branch's multitude of federal agencies and departments. And let us never forget the money behind it all. The corporations and mega-rich individuals, Wall Street, the banks, the big donors and their foundations, the many super PACs that gather and bundle cash that is then used to convince the politicians and their parties to support the initiatives of those who provide the money that makes our government move in ways that so often seem at odds with the best interests of the American people. Those who cycle from these private entities into government work bring with them to their jobs in what is supposed to be the people's government. Whatever the political perspectives, goals, and wants are of those who previously employed them in the private sector. And then there's yet another revolving door between all of that and the news media. People work for a candidate or a party, then move on to work for a political consulting firm, make a name for themselves, and then find themselves on television and their stars rise from there. They sign with the right Hollywood talent agency, and then it's book deals, breakfast speaking engagements, and maybe even their own political show on one of the cable networks. Combined with all their many like-minded organizations, the two major political parties in America are complete industries. To be a person so favored in life as to work high up in one of the parties, to walk the corridors of power in Washington, and then, as needed, be able to move seamlessly into positions within the vast NGO ecosystems or the news media, is to enjoy an active, fulfilling career with all the social and professional rewards needed to ensure a lifetime of privilege. The relationships higher-ups in either of our two major parties must cultivate with donors requires them to seamlessly fit in with some of the wealthiest, privileged, eccentric, and out-of-touch individuals in the world. To suggest that there would be a disconnect between this culture of political power in Washington, in all of its dazzling forms, and regular Americans and their real-world problems out in flyover country is the most tragic of understatements. Our political system is largely controlled by the system itself and those thriving within it and feeding upon it. The moment that finally broke me personally, what convinced me of the self-serving influence and decidedly undemocratic power of all this massive permanent party infrastructure, and what ultimately took away what little remaining faith I had in the modern Democratic Party, was Super Tuesday 2020. The two leading candidates to that point in the primary, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, Two candidates with progressive ideas that brought hope and excitement to old-school Democrats like myself, that we might finally land someone in the White House who spoke to the needs and concerns of regular working and middle-class Americans, were leapfrogged over by literally the weakest and certainly the most uninspiring candidate in the field, 78-year-old former Vice President and longtime United States Senator Joe Biden. This was accomplished by way of a backroom deal orchestrated by the very behind-the-scenes Democratic Party players described in this piece. The result saw most of the other top Democratic candidates drop out of the race over the weekend prior to Super Tuesday and throw their support to the former vice president. This was done in exchange for future political favors, like the one that would see a small city Indiana mayor awarded the cabinet-level federal government position of Secretary of Transportation in the Biden administration. Then in the Democratic Party's version of John McCain picking the achingly unqualified Sarah Palin to be his running mate in 2008, the already doddering Biden would select possibly the weakest big-name candidate in the entire 2020 Democratic primary field, Senator Kamala Harris of California, who, despite the backing of some of the most powerful interests in Democratic Party politics, found herself exposed over and over again during her short and painful primary season run as the very walking, talking personification of an empty pantsuit. Super Tuesday 2020 was a watershed moment in American party politics. It instantly made clear that the once fabled party of the people was more interested in preserving the status quo within its own ranks and protecting itself from the internal upheaval a President Bernie Sanders might create in its cloistered neoliberal bubble than it was ever interested in doing anything of substance for the American people. At first, I struggled for a way to explain all this to myself and to others. Then I came up with the following: the analogy. Let's use some other kind of pair of competing organizations, hospitals, and let's pick someplace far away, the lovely Monte Carlo in the Principality of Monaco. Two hospitals, and let's just make up some names: the Democratic Hospital of Monte Carlo and the Republican Hospital of Monaco. Let's say that these two hospitals long ago dropped any pretense of being healthcare providers available to the general population of resort and service workers of this fabulously wealthy Riviera enclave. Both hospitals are incredibly well funded by the affluent of Monaco and cater to that class of patients, and access by regular folks to the top-notch healthcare they both provide is minimal. Let's also pretend that every 4 years there are internal elections that determine who the executives are at the top of each organization. But, as things always turn out, long-established regimes hang on to power no matter the results of any particular election. What that looks like is the names are always familiar at the top of the system, and all the support personnel stays the same, all the way down to the office staff. Everyone is well paid and happy, and that's the way things have always been. Then one day at the Democratic Hospital, a facility that was incidentally founded by and for the workers of Monaco, a faction starts to take hold that wants to bring the focus of the hospital, at least to some degree, back to its original mission of providing more and better healthcare to the working classes of Monaco. And so they run their candidates for C-suite positions from other offices in the hospital system. Their platform is basically to speak out, and rightly so, about the influence big money donors have in determining who receives the first-class healthcare their hospital provides, and of course, to promise change. Now here's the point. Everyone knows that should this new faction actually win the election at the Democratic Hospital, that its leaders would oust all those who currently hold power and positions there and replace the old guard with like-minded types who feel as they do that the mission of the hospital should be to provide care of equal quality to everyone who needs it. This is a threat, of course, to more than just the current team of execs and support staff at the Democratic Hospital. It's a threat to the power and influence of the donors. After all, they're paying for the hospital as it's currently structured. But this is also a threat even to the status quo at the Republican Hospital of Monaco. Because if a more egalitarian faction should take over at the Democratic Hospital, it might pressure the Republican Hospital to enact similar changes. So let me pose a question. Who and what do you think the executives at the Democratic Hospital would be more focused on? A, making sure that the internal election threat to their hold on power and their well-paid positions at their own hospital is defeated? Or B, Do you think that while facing this internal and potentially existential challenge to both their status and livelihoods, the Democratic hospital executives would be more concerned with the everyday year-in and year-out business as usual of trying to outcompete their crosstown business rival, the Republican Hospital of Monaco? That's my analogy of what is and has been going on in the Democratic Party these last few election cycles. I've come to believe that those who sit at the top of the party don't care as much about winning elections as they do about holding on to the reins of power in their own organization and pushing back against whomever threatens their iron grip on the political party itself. And just like in my hospital analogy, let's not forget the role of the powerful donors who have been paying for and getting exactly the kind of political party they want. If you really think about this on a human level, you can understand how much more committed anyone so involved with the Democratic Party would be to hanging on to this all-powerful political machine funded by corporations and defense contractors in Hollywood and Wall Street, and with all the accompanying perks of power than they would ever be concerned about losing to Republicans in election cycles that come around every 2 and 4 years. The Democratic Party is one of the most powerful organizations the world has ever known. At any one time, it controls roughly half of the government of the most powerful nation on the planet. It dictates U.S. domestic and foreign policy according to the whim and fancy of its super-rich donors. So much of what constitutes this one political party is unelected, sitting just slightly outside of the elective offices and thus beyond the control of the American people. Maybe on the government payroll, maybe just off of it, sitting in between the elected officials and the donors who pay for them. This part of it, the Democratic National Committee, the party infrastructure, including all the friendly above-mentioned extra-governmental, pro-democratic party groups, is one immensely powerful, incestuous, and corrupt political monster. If the Democrats had lost the 2020 presidential election, they would have just tangoed on. All of their infrastructure would have still been in place. As it is, nothing is likely to unseat this level of entrenched power. Change is a pipe dream. Every effort will amount to nothing. It will continue to be business as usual within the Democratic Party and our democratically unresponsive federal government. Nothing will ever really change except incrementally and never truly delivering change for the American people who exist far outside the elite-run political process. Nothing demonstrates any of this more clearly than what happened in the 2020 Democratic primary. The party orchestrated the leapfrogging of the 2 weakest candidates to the top of the ticket. Joe Biden was even then in a state of obvious mental decline. The party didn't care. Kamala Harris's mercifully brief primary run was one of the most humiliating examples of an empty vessel politician being exposed as such under the glare and scrutiny of a national election process as anyone has ever seen. But the Democratic Party didn't care. The Democrats certainly preferred that their ticket win the presidential election. But it wasn't essential. Their primary goal was stopping either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren from ascending to leadership positions in their party. Sanders and Warren, certainly to varying degrees, were the only truly existential threat as far as the Democratic Party elite was concerned. Defeating this threat from within was the most pressing matter for the party, and it would have been under great pressure from all of its major donors, Wall Street, defense contractors, big pharma and energy, to do precisely that, first and foremost. Losing control of the Democratic Party to a crowd that actually wanted to focus on helping the people while having it simultaneously pulled away from the control and influence of its mega-rich benefactors? That was simply never an option. So the Democratic Party decision-makers orchestrated their Super Tuesday primary coup. But here's the problem. When people have been abandoned, they know it, and they know it first before anyone else. They know it first because they live it and feel it in real time. The Democratic Party and the affluent elites who control its platforms and emphasis over the last many decades have abandoned, region by region, demographic by demographic, the working people of this country. And the people know it. They have been abandoned by the only political party that could possibly represent their economic interests. And they've been humiliated and scorned by those within that party on their way out the door. The words that have become the standard to describe what we used to call regular Americans includes everything from Hillary's deplorables comment to the much more inflammatory language we see on Twitter every day. These people are never going to forget any of it or get over it, and then happily agree or like or vote with those who have said these things about them. All of this destruction, what has become a dangerously toxic political chasm in America, is because of what the Democratic Party has become. As true Democrats, or even as former Democrats, we need to understand and acknowledge that our own side has been taken over by a predatory class of political professionals whose sole purpose is to protect their own power and status. Right now, as it is, the people of this country have no political party representing their needs and desires in government. I've been a Democrat my entire life, but what I want and need now is what most Americans have desperately needed for decades. We need a political party of our own that actually works on behalf of the people. And as difficult as it may be, we need to admit to ourselves that right now, the modern Democratic Party is not that party.